Okay, so I think people are still joining, but I think we'll make a start. So good evening. Welcome to Draw 2 with Dr. Nicole Porter for International Women's Day. I'm Lucy Grierson, Partnerships Manager with the RIBA's Midlands team. This year's International Women's Day theme is Choose to Challenge, with the onus on all of us to call out gender bias and inequality when we see it and to do more to celebrate and give a platform to women's achievements. As well as being part of the RIBA's wider International Women's Day celebrations, this evening's event is the last in a series of regional activities organised in partnership with the East Midlands 2 Women in Architecture groups for International Women's Day, with generous support from Ibstock Brick. I'll introduce Nicole in a moment, but just some housekeeping first. The event is being recorded, and if we could ask that while Nicole is speaking, you keep your cameras off and yourselves muted, that would be great. Thank you. There will be time for questions at the end of the session, but do feel free to post questions in the chat during the event. And if you'd like to turn your camera on to ask your question in person at the end, when you're invited to do so, that'd be great. So, to tonight's event. There may be some of you who attended our interactive workshop Draw back in December or may not have been able to make it last time, but Nicole will be presenting her observational drawing project, Artist in Residence, during lockdown and sharing the same drawings as last time and the commentary, but with some new observations. So to our speaker. Dr. Nicole Porter is Associate Professor of Architecture and Landscape at the University of Nottingham. Prior to coming to Nottingham, she worked in academia and in the public sector in Canberra and Melbourne. She is the author of the book Landscape and Branding, the Promotion and Production of Place, and has published over 40 academic and conference papers delivered in over 20 countries. Her research focuses on the many values that humans associate with nature and interprets how these values are embodied in contemporary landscape design and policy. I'll now hand over to Nicole. Thanks, Nicole.
Great, thank you so much, Lucy. Thanks for a very generous introduction and indeed for inviting me back here after the first workshops that we did back in December. Who would have thought we would still be in lockdown after all this time, hey? But hopefully there's signs that things are shifting, that we've on that road to recovery. I'd like to also, acknowledge the sponsors and thank you for such a wonderful series of talks that we've already had so far. So it's a real privilege to be part of this sort of lineup, and also to thank you all for being here. Because I'm sharing my screen, I can't actually see anybody at the moment. I feel like I'm, this lockdown experience of being talking to the void. But thank you for being here. I get to see you all the other end of the slides. And also want to just acknowledge that you're taking the time out, because I think most people would agree this has been an unusual time in terms of our temporal experience and the amount of sort of demands and energy that it can take on just working from home or adapting to the sort of the lockdown restrictions, however they might be affecting us. So to take your time out on a Wednesday evening to still be on screen is something I really appreciate, and I hope you'll be able to sort of sit back and enjoy the drawings that I'm going to share with you this evening. So what is Draw, or as I've also called it, Artist in Residence, referring to the fact that I was drawing in residence at home, as we all have been. In short, this is a practice that explores how observational drawing of our immediate environment, particularly outside of the view out the window, can generate greater awareness of place, and that exploring the well-being benefits of drawing and of this sort of mindful attention and shared experience is something of importance. And it's within the context of lockdown, although dare I say that drawing in this way and sharing in this way has benefits outside of lockdown context as well. I have to do a shout out, as it were, to Aisha Batul, one of our PhD scholars at the University of Nottingham, whose work, she's the expert on window views, in fact. She's just about to complete her doctorate and she's already had work published here. I'm just doing the abstract here from her article, Window Views, Difference of Perception During the COVID-19 Lockdown. So she's already collected a lot of data pre-COVID and then during COVID of people's windows views and preferences, and has found that spending time at home has influenced the way that we value our window views. and how we engage with them. So I certainly recommend checking out her work. So before I share my drawings, I'm just going to go through a bit of sort of context here. This first slide is from Public Health England, back a while now, in sort of what I would call the early days of lockdown, although it was updated in August. And it acknowledges what I think most of us would know, is that there has been a lot of mental health impacts due to the social isolation and the disruption to our lives because of the pandemic response. But in advising how to take care of ourselves, Public Health England suggested, amongst other things, that we could draw, that we could go outside or sit by a window where going outside was not possible, and also setting daily routines and goals, achievable goals, or ways of improving our well-being. And indeed, this daily practice of drawing from my window encapsulates or puts all those into practice. The next aspect of the work relates to paying attention in a particular way, which is often referred to as mindfulness. So here's a shot from Yale Medical School. It's one of many places, including the NHS as well, who do recommend mindful practice as a means of managing anxiety, depression, and generally improving well-being and focus. They did say within the pandemic, this is particularly relevant, and I quote, the clinicians there state that mindfulness is about being in the moment, observing what's coming at you from the outside and what's coming up inside, taking it in and observing and not reacting to it. So not getting caught up in our sort of immediate feelings and responses, but just being able to stand back and as that, observe in a somewhat neutral way, or even if we're getting caught up in something, to observe that we're getting caught up in it. Really important. A lot of the time we can just be in a state of sort of distraction, as it were. And I'll try to explain later on about how this drawing practice is in effect an embodiment of mindfulness. Because mindfulness is often associated with meditation and sort of formal practice, and it's developing that skill of being attending to our present moment experience, but we can be mindful doing all sorts of things. So here's a local definition. It's actually from the UK All Parliamentary Group from 2015. This report that they published really affirms that mindfulness is a really beneficial practice across, particularly in healthcare, in education, but also in the general population. And they define it as paying attention to what's happening in the present moment in the mind, body, and external environment with an attitude of curiosity and kindness. So having a background in a sort of built environment theory and practice, when I see the words external environment, had to highlight those so that in the context here, it's not that being mindful is just about how I'm feeling or about what my body's doing, where my mind is at, but it's actually about the relation and the interaction between myself and the external world. And I'm sure as architects, as designers, we're highly conscious of the direct and indirect effects that buildings, that landscapes have upon our health and well-being, whether we're conscious of that at the time or not. This is an issue that's been sort of picked up by a number of individuals and organisations during COVID. So the notion that we can mindfully pay attention to really notice the everyday and be in the moment. So one of those was the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, who had a campaign encouraging people to engage with and appreciate everyday nature. Obviously, many of us, couldn't go out to national parks or travel, but could we just notice the nature going on around our everyday urban or residential environments? And similarly, David Hockney, early on in the pandemic, was in the media encouraging us to use art to engage with nature, and again to sort of stop and notice just the everyday details. He was fortunate to be in lockdown in Normandy, so had some rather lovely landscapes that he could depict, and you see him sharing one here. Further on in this article that was published, he said that, you know, he suggests people draw, not to use a camera in particular. He also said, I suggest people really look hard at something and think about what they are seeing. We need art, and I do think it can relieve stress, because what is stress? It's worrying about something in the future. Art is now. I think this statement aligns entirely with the premise of mindfulness, that if you're really engrossed in an act of sort of artistic production or being fascinated either by nature, for example, you are in the present. You're not worrying about the past or planning what should be happening in the future. And Hockney's put this in a contemporary context, but now I just want to refer back to John Ruskin, to Victorian times, who's another artist, in this case architectural critic, who really championed drawing as a means of observing the world closely, of understanding it, and then potentially translating that understanding into design. And I love this quote where he says he would rather teach drawing so that his pupils learn to love nature, not that they're just looking at nature so that they can learn to draw. And this is really central to my approach here. It's that I wasn't drawing to produce wonderful drawings. I was drawing to observe, drawing as a process of observation. Sometimes that's hard to do, and I'll touch on that as well in terms of our inner critic and judging the quality of the final product. However, really the emphasis here, and I encourage, you know, anybody who's drawing or who says, oh, I can't draw very well, or I wish I could draw like this, really drawing is also, can be extremely valuable as a process in its own right, regardless of the quality of what ends up on paper. It's what you've seen and what you have noticed as a result of that. And sometimes it's really unexpected and really exciting as well. So why draw windows? I think Aisha's research already has alerted us to the fact that windows have become more important during lockdown, because they're our portal to the outside world when we have to stay indoors. But this is certainly reflected in other social media and other creative projects that have taken place in 2020 and still continue now. So there's just some examples here from the media of people sharing photos, in fact putting their footage of their window views online in a site called Window Swap. And we saw students at university putting up messages in windows to communicate with the outside world. And although I haven't got a drawing of it, clearly there was the whole NHS rainbow kind of display that was a real feature of our COVID experience here in the UK. I think that these various practices reveal how the act of noticing, but then also recording and sharing and indeed celebrating our windows has become part of the COVID-19 experience. And it illustrates our collective creative attempts to adapt to this. So I've just got a couple more examples before I share this sort of series of drawings. I wanted to really acknowledge the work that we did back in December with the 2 workshops here with the RIBA. So we had a workshop after I presented my drawings. The invitation was for the participants to go away and do their own window drawings and then come back and share them. So we had several people that did participate, and during that follow-up workshop in December, we did 2 word clouds, as well as having quite a lengthy discussion and discussing people's drawings in depth. This first one was about the immediate impression. So after we saw everyone's drawings, I just asked everybody, you know, what are the 3 words that come to mind? What did you see? What impressions did you get from everyone else's impressions of their views and the world that they were experiencing that week in December 2020 when they were drawing? Most people were in Nottingham, by the way, but others were not in Nottingham. So we weren't just looking at Nottingham landscapes or buildings. So there's some great words here. We saw a lot of gardens, we saw a lot of trees, but also some of these descriptive words, I think, point to the fact that the drawings weren't just depicting the physical spaces outside the window. There was a lot of emotive content here, you know, and sort of atmosphere. So whether the spaces were quiet, whether they were cozy or comfortable, peaceful, personal, you know, again, very domestic environments, the seasons and so on. I can point out, by the way, there's one word there, regret, and I remember at the time there was a discussion, oh, somebody saw regret in the images. I know the person, I subsequently had a conversation with that participant who said, I said regret, and it was because they hadn't taken the time to do drawings, but when they saw everyone else's, they regretted it and said, I wish I'd made the time. I wish I'd been able to do some of these drawings. Again, a theme I want to touch on later today. The second word cloud that we had from the workshop was in response to the question, so for those of the people who had done these drawings between the first and second workshop, what was the experience? And for me, this was particularly revealing. What do you get from just sitting down and doing a drawing outside your window for a few days? Clearly the words focused, reflective and calming came up repeatedly. That's why they're bigger. As someone who was, again, encouraging a sort of mindful approach, those three words encapsulate mindfulness: to be focused, to also be kind of reflecting, and ideally one of the effects of taking that time out and just engaging in the present moment and the world around you is that it can calm you down. So that was a really positive response. There's lots of other words here as well in terms of being absorbed and relaxed and being fascinated and contemplative, but also there's a couple there in terms of, you know, finding it difficult, finding it annoying, perhaps if the drawing, you know, doesn't quite work the way you want. So in fact, you know, this sort of observational drawing is not always going to be calming or relaxing. One other example here I just had to share. I was fortunate to do the similar workshop with some architecture students at a Turkish university last month. And my colleague there, Berkak, also as the teacher, went away and did her drawings for a week, and she shared this one, which I think is just wonderful. So we're looking at Ankara in February this year. And Berkak described how she'd been looking out the window and a delivery man came with a parcel for one of her neighbours. I think this is probably something a lot of us can identify with, and I drew delivery people in the drawings you're about to see. We've been at home, a lot of us are getting stuff delivered, but I love the way that she's just captured this anonymity, really, of this person with their face mask on, just a moment where they've turned, about to go back into the van that's on the right hand side there. And just the hint of the surrounding context. But when Berkak was talking about this drawing, she noted that she'd been sitting at the window, we were going to start the drawing, this person arrived, and she started the drawing very quickly to capture that moment. She was in the moment, but of course he went out of view very quickly, running up the street to do the delivery, and she sat there and waited. She said, I had to kind of just, literally I'd done half the sort of drawing and I had to wait until he came back. And then he was walking in the opposite direction, so I actually had to do a mirror version of what I was seeing, but I managed to just get his profile on his return journey before he got back in the van and he was gone. And I love that kind of, that creative adaptation that she had in that moment, and obviously being quite engrossed, very difficult to be worried or thinking about other things when you're just, you know, getting that moment down on paper. I hope you'd agree, I think this is a really fascinating drawing. Final slide before we look at the main drawings themselves. I really had to put in something about International Women's Day, and it so happens that these statistics from the Office of National Statistics were published earlier today. They show some interpretation of a number of statistics from last year, so the period of when these drawings took place, but right up until January. There's a mix of stats actually, so I haven't had a chance to look at them in a lot of detail, but one that I pulled out was that indeed women have reported higher anxiety and depression and loneliness than men, which is shown here on the left. But at the same time, there were some other stats that I think we need to acknowledge about the fact there've been higher mortality amongst men than women. There's also some statistics about childcare and the amount of unpaid work that's been taking place at home during COVID, and perhaps some of those inequalities. So I do encourage you all, if you want to get this sort of more quantifiable account of how COVID and lockdown has affected us, there's plenty of data out there. It's still going to keep coming. And it's something that I'm going to work on, to really look at more of that data and sort of compare it with the drawings and the visual record that I've created for the same period of time. Because in a way, I feel that when we're talking about the built environment, when we're talking about people's experiences and relationship with the built environment and its impact on us, that in fact, a lot of that qualitative information as well as quantitative data is important. So in a time when we're presented with daily stats about COVID and these other sorts of longitudinal statistics, I'm really interested to see what qualitative information such as drawing, which is very subjective, but what this might reveal about the individual lived experience of lockdown, and what we can learn from this, as well as learning from the sort of the metadata, the big picture quantitative patterns. And that leads me to my final sort of, I wouldn't say that it's a warning, but it's worth reiterating that, of course, this is a personal project. I'm still in the process of reflecting on it myself. And now that I've shared it a few times with different audiences, some people have actually said this is rather depressing and a bit unsettling. We're looking at a period of time in history that has been unsettling, and so there is an element of isolation and indeed of anxiety in these images. But what I'll invite you to do is now sort of sit back and watch. I'm going to talk a bit about them from a thematic point of view. I'll sometimes talk about the individual drawings a bit, but generally the invitation is to sit back and sort of watch them as they slide by, and to be mindful of your own experience of this as well, and how you've been feeling during this really unusual time. So we start back in March last year. It was actually the 17th of March. And on that day, I'd been at the university teaching architecture, delivered a lecture to people that were already wearing masks. And my employer had told me I had to go home. I had to evacuate. So when I went home that evening, I pulled out an A5 sketchbook, sat on the couch by the first floor window in my terrace house in Nottingham, and I drew what I saw outside. And on that day, what I noticed was the low brick wall, the gate with this private sign on it, and the two trees in the foreground. I think that first drawing was rather pensive. It was a little bit kind of almost lonely, but also a bit unsettled. But I can't exactly say why I was motivated to draw on that day. Normally when I draw, it's when I'm travelling, and obviously we haven't been travelling much of late, but I draw when I'm in somewhere new and want to really record it and notice it. But on this day, it was just doing it at home. And as you can see, this very quickly became a daily practice. And been part of digesting my experience, and also kind of taking the opportunity to really just notice my local environment when normally I'm not there during the day as much. The practice quickly evolved from a personal pastime into a more intentionally reflective and theoretically informed process of visual documentation. And the core questions that sort of emerged as I continued on into March, with my cat also looking on, what is the relationship between people, health, and the places where we are locked down? How can nature and architecture enable or inhibit social distancing or connectedness? And for me personally, how could the creative practice of observational drawing provide insight or therapeutic benefit. Again, it's a very different process to perhaps designing and drawing through a design process. This was purely just to look and record what I could see. So I might just talk a bit now about the window itself. So we're seeing it there in that framed view. It is a double hung timber sash. It's not the original Victorian one, it's actually double glazed because we had it replaced because it was very cold and drafty, but we had it replaced by a joiner who reproduced the original. And indeed, I hope you can see a certain affection for that window that I have in these drawings. It's very tactile, can open it to get the summer breeze that we'll see later on. And I think it's well proportioned and it's also well oriented. It captures the afternoon light, which as we see in these images, as lockdown stretched on and as spring became summer, more light entered the window and came deep into the room. Of course, this is one of the key functions of windows, why we design them and why we value them. They provide a view, they provide light and brightness and illumination for task performance. But more importantly, they connect us to the outside world. They give us useful information about the environment we're in and what's going on out there. They also provide an opportunity for a visual break and a change of scene or focus. So here, when I was, watching my neighbours have a bask in the sun, or watching the window cleaner walk along and actually talk to the neighbours inside, really taking his time to break down some of that social isolation. These small moments that I was able to share were something that took me away from being at my desk. I could actually pause and notice someone and just almost share in their moment, sitting in the garden or watching the shadows on a bright sunny morning, casting the shadows of my side of the street onto the road below. This was again an important part of taking time out, and it was indeed something that I struggled with at times when I had a lot to do. It's why I said at the outset it's important that we give ourselves permission in a way to take time out to do things for ourselves, even if it's just a few moments here or there, because otherwise we may miss out on those moments. They just pass us by. In turning our attention to the window, the final observation I'd like to make and just acknowledge is that indeed there is empirical evidence that suggests that the view from the window does have a tangible physiological as well as mental health benefit. So Roger Ulrich's pioneering work in healthcare settings sought to demonstrate that if you've got a view out of your window of trees and vegetation instead of a brick wall and a car park, you will have better health outcomes. And I would say that although I do have a brick wall that I was looking out on, I had enough trees and vegetation and exposure to nature to also benefit, to have some of those health benefits. So that moves me on to the view of nature itself. And so from the window, framing that view to what were the components of nature that we're seeing here, or the manifestations of them. So we get things like the rain, the seasonality, the changing light and seasons. We certainly get people's pets and animals, a very key sort of element of non-human life. We also get the trees and the seasonal change of the trees from spring through to summer and then to autumn. Although I do not look out over the countryside of Normandy like David Hockney, there is indeed many types of urban nature to observe when we look really closely for it. I'll note that I do have a back garden, and so I could have been drawing that, but in fact I was quite interested in drawing the public and semi-public realm. So you get things like this, you get the neighbours walking the dog. And these magpies that we see here were certainly a key element of nature and the cycle of nature that I'll return to again shortly, and you'll see a lot more of them now that they've started building their nest, which you can now see here as well. It has been noted by the UK government that green space is needed to support our well-being during the pandemic. So in fact, there was a report they published titled Improving Access to Green Space, a review for 2020. And in there, Public Health England asserted that the COVID-19 pandemic has made many of us all the more aware of how much we value and rely on our outdoor spaces to support our health and well-being. They continue that evidence shows that living in a greener environment can promote and protect good health, aid in recovery from illness, help with managing poor health, and that greener environments are associated with better mental health outcomes and reduced levels of depression, anxiety and fatigue, and enhanced quality of life. They also note that green space can help to bind communities together and reduce loneliness, and that disadvantaged groups appear to gain a larger health benefit and have reduced socioeconomic related inequalities in health when living in greener communities. So green space and a greener urban environment can also be used as an important tool in the drive to build a fairer society. So as you've been seeing, I think my neighbours and I do benefit from this green space. It is a semi-private space, so the fact that there is a low wall and that visual access means it's already got a very different character to if it had been purely completely enclosed and private. It's not quite the same as a public park, but it does evidence a lot of the same functions and qualities of a public park. So here we see two of the neighbours getting together for a drink while their dogs run around. I would say that, taking a critical view of the green space, it's very low on biodiversity. There's really not a lot to it. It's composed of a few trees, lawn, shrubs, and indeed a stump where a former tree had stood, some washing lines, those benches and some paths, as well as some car parking at the rear. And that's pretty much it. But look at what sort of functions it can serve. Here there was a party in May, so a bit of social distancing not being observed. But I have to highlight that one because I'd lived on that street for over 6 years, and that was the first time I'd seen all my neighbours across the street getting together in that way. So I think one of the positive effects really of lockdown was that it did mean more people were gathering outdoors and interacting. They were pretty noisy, by the way. They were certainly having a really good time that evening. So as we continue seeing some of the other evidence of people's activities in the outdoor space, such as gardening here, I just want to digress momentarily to talk about those trees that feature so prominently in these sketches. Specifically here, just seeing the shadow of one of them, for example, and tracing that out. The two immediately opposite in this so-called private garden, and a third that grows on the grassy verge to the right. I believe that they're a type of maple, and it's a species that, to be fair, I had not really paid a great deal of attention to before this project, because maple trees certainly have many more iconic and sort of dramatic examples. Like Japanese maples or the Canadian maple. This one, the Acer tassaceum, is it's easy to overlook in a way. It can be a bit shrubby. It's not as dramatic. They're short, compact, and hardy. But in fact, they're often used and specified in sort of street tree planting because they're pretty hardy. It was clearly also a wonderful home for the magpies, which you see again in flight here, and I'll talk a bit about that drawing in a second as well. I was able to actually identify the exact species more accurately in autumn, so I was paying attention to them and becoming curious, but it was only when the colour changed that I could really be a bit more certain. And naming these trees felt a bit like when you recognise the comings and goings of people living in your street year on year, but until you're introduced, you have no idea about their names or where they come from. They're somewhat familiar, but also kind of overlooked and anonymous. But once you know their names, you feel better acquainted. So I became better acquainted with the trees, as well as better acquainted with my neighbours across the street and their various animal companions. And also became a lot more familiar with the birds. So I've mentioned the magpies there, but I've also seen the ubiquitous pigeons coming and going, jackdaws, swifts, crows, and the very noisy magpie. That drawing I highlighted where the bird was in flight. The reason I highlighted that was because I had a very similar experience to my colleague Burkak. It was one where I'd been watching those birds coming and going, started the drawing, and in a moment of flight I was able to draw most of that magpie, but not all of it. And then I had to sit and wait, because I thought, I've seen them coming and going, feeding the chicks. If I wait long enough, it will return. And I actually had to wait quite a while. I remember feeling a bit impatient, had to be getting on with other things, but it was a gorgeous, beautiful sunny evening. And I just had to kind of give in to the idea I was going to sit there and stare and wait until the bird returned. Tempted just to go online and look up a magpie and draw it in flight, but I did stick with it, and eventually that cycle did repeat itself and I was able to get the moment that I was seeking. So from nature, now on to people, and here we are getting into the height of summer, still walking the dogs, still spending a lot of time outside. I think as these images have rolled along, you may have recognised some recurring characters, either alone or gathered together. And by spying on the comings and goings of people, I was engaging in a pastime that has been shown to be one of the key functions of public space and of windows, and that is to watch each other. I love William White's work, the American urbanist, organisational analyst, journalist and people watcher. He published work in the 1980s looking at the social life of small urban spaces, and he and his research team used a range of methods to look at plazas in New York in particular and parks to sort of really forensically kind of figure out, what do people do, where do they sit, where do they stand, how much time do they spend, and how does the design of that environment encourage particular kinds of interaction and behaviour. So his work and these methods have gone on to be highly influential. Indeed, we do a lot of this now with GPS and with phones, so I'm a bit old-fashioned, doing it the old-fashioned way by just sitting and actually drawing. And certainly I won't have observed, even a fraction, I suppose, of the number of individual people and interactions that have happened. But I did start to notice some patterns. And I think, perhaps because I was drawing, I was perhaps getting certain qualities of people's lives during this time that might have been overlooked if I was just literally, counting the number of people and documenting exactly how long they were spending and what they were doing. So these particular observations, I think, have affirmed the value of having a well-maintained, flexible and quite simple green space for residents to make use of. And here, I see the two ladies again, walking the dogs, having a chat. Another person walks by, having a chat. These kind of incidental moments. As well as these fleeting moments of chatting, and I will acknowledge, by the way, an ambulance coming during COVID. There were these, again, fleeting moments, but really quite significant, you might say. We've also seen people chatting from windows. We've seen people working in windows, such as you see here, back to back. We see people getting together, sitting in the sunshine, having a chat, putting out the washing, certainly a very regular occurrence, mostly by females, but I will add, on International Women's Day, I saw men putting out the washing as well. And we also saw earlier those other larger gatherings. So there's moments of incidental gatherings and interactions, but there's also kind of organised gatherings too. And this space accommodates them both really well. We also saw people working, not just doing the washing, but you may have noticed some maintenance workers coming and going and mowing the lawn a few times. This is because this particular residential environment that we've been looking at is in fact social housing. So it's run by the local authority. So the tenants here indeed have the property or these sort of shared parts of the property looked after for them. But the gardening that they were doing with these lovely pots that you see that emerged during lockdown are an addition that they chose to undertake. I would like to acknowledge Frances, the presentation she gave on Monday about how we live and work from home, or in fact live at work in some cases, and that those blurred boundaries are really, really important. And in fact, working from home might be more of the norm. But she also noted that social tenants, so tenants in social housing like this, need permission to work from home often. It's part of their tenancy agreement. They wouldn't be allowed to operate from home. So there might be some potential tensions there. And I've just noted the gardening aspect. So it is worth noting that, in fact, again, in the several years that I lived in this location, I hadn't really seen any gardening because it's done by maintenance workers until COVID, in which case these other pots and plants started appearing in the shared garden. And indeed, there is some existing evidence and research that's showing that gardening itself has emerged as a notable response across the country to getting through lockdown, both the therapeutic benefit and just the benefit of being outdoors. I'd say that actually it's also an expression of collective identity. So there's a little pocket of guerrilla gardening on the street corner that got added to during COVID. And like all front yard types of gardening expressions, this grassroots approach to planting in public spaces is both an act for oneself and a way of communicating with each other, saying, I'm a proud owner of this property and I'm taking care of it. It's a real sense of community. So on to briefly the gentleman that we just saw there with his dog, who we've seen a lot. I just want to really, and here he is again, having a drink as well. He's there often and hence figures repeatedly in this visual record, along with his dog, morning, noon, and indeed there's even one coming up as our days get shorter when he's there late into the night with his dog wearing a light around his collar for illumination. In fact, seeing my neighbour with his obvious affection for his companion, and also the obvious enjoyment he has when chatting with his neighbours, having a drink, as he is again here, it makes me wonder where he would have been if this particular housing development didn't have this space for him to be in and to bump into other people. Would he have been in his own private garden or been indoors? I think he alone is evidence of the importance of having some kind of outdoor shared space. And the other valuable contribution that this social space made is, of course, for me. So as a resident across the street, watching all these comings and goings, my social isolation was tempered by seeing the familiar faces of neighbours and sharing in their presence, despite the distance of kind of being one floor up and across the street. So there is an element of detachment, you might say, as I said, in terms of being an observer on the other side of the glass. So now as the drawings move into, I think we're almost up to September, so we've got a few more to go here as we track on. One of the neighbours from around the corner there just pausing for a moment to lean against the wall. I now want to turn my attention to drawing itself as a process, and what I've sort of experienced and learnt from this process here as we see the second time an ambulance visited our street. Drawing is a process that yields forms of knowledge that are distinct from other forms of representation or documentation. And indeed, this kind of drawing is different from other analytical or sort of generative design type work. Indeed, we teach students to draw by going on field trips and say, you know, draw this important building or this park. And it's not just to get a record of it, it's by drawing it, by stopping to draw, you're actually seeing it in a different way. In a recent article titled Situating Skill, Contemporary Observational Drawing as a Spatial Method in Geographical Research, the artist and geographer Sage Bryce explores this potential for observational drawing as a method, and I quote, for attunement to spatial, temporal, material and cultural relations that play out in the storying of a landscape. And she suggests that drawing sort of offers us different possibilities to get to know a people and place. There could be a criticism that this is too ocular central. It's sort of just foregrounding the visual. And I agree with that. I think that there's a lot about the other senses, the non-visual, that perhaps is hard to capture through a two-dimensional drawing. At times I've used text, although I refrained a little bit from using words to kind of talk about what I was hearing, or perhaps what was outside of the immediate view that I was seeking to capture. But I would also argue that actually drawing is more than just looking. It's embodied. Our hand and our arm, and sometimes our whole body moves. Admittedly, I was working most of the time in a sketchbook, really small scale, you know, capturing these intimate moments of a man sitting alone with his head bowed, or now the ubiquitous face mask being blown down the street. But actually, even when I was drawing, depending on the day and the mood, sometimes I was quite aware of that movement. Other times I was almost kind of engrossed in it and wouldn't notice if I was hunched over, as I did notice here and capture when I was drawing my own reflection in the glass. Or here when a painter came to touch up the windows and give them another external coat. But I didn't want to actually be seen drawing him, so did my drawing when he was out of view. In reflecting on this sort of what I think is the real value of drawing this way, I'd like to return to John Ruskin, whose quote we had at the beginning here, and his assertion that to draw is to really see. And the first vital principle of drawing is that man is intended to observe with his eyes and mind. There's a lovely anecdote that's published where Ruskin described his own experience of drawing, which I found particularly resonant. And this is where he talks about kind of becoming immersed in the drawing. I just want to read this one out. He wrote, "Lying on the bank of a cart road in the sand, with no prospect whatever but a small aspen tree against the blue sky, languidly but not idly, I began to draw it. And as I drew, the languor passed away. The beautiful lines insisted on being traced without weariness. More and more beautiful they became as each rose out of the rest and took its place in the air. With wonder increasing every instant, I saw that they composed themselves." And I love this drawing, just as, you know, when I drew this, drew the tree here in autumn, at the start of October, knowing that actually there aren't too many more of these drawings to be done, which you'll see in a moment. I felt like he was describing, sometimes there's this sense of his arm tracing the lines of a tree and his attention being lifted, but also sort of just feeling really engrossed and fascinated, and in fact quite joyful. So some of these drawings, as I've alluded to, I was either frustrated by, I was distracted, perhaps not so mindful. Other moments are real moments of joy. You know, there's a brief shower on a sunny day, and watching the person rush to get their washing in while I rush to get my pen to capture that, you know, sort of 30 seconds. Or other days like this one, it had been a really long day. I was actually back at work then. Lockdown was, it was that period between lockdown. In fact, I'd probably wouldn't normally have taken the time to draw, except that I was now determined to stick with my one a day routine and see it through to the end. So one of the real challenges of this, and I think the benefit of doing it every day, was the repetition, trying to notice something new each time. And I sort of continually surprised myself, really, just when I thought, I'm so sick of being here, and how can I possibly find something different to draw? And sometimes I think you would agree these drawings are repetitive, but other times, you know, it's a moth, it's a different shadow, it's a different person, different quality of light or time of day, or different medium, if it's usually pen. But there was usually always something new in the present moment to see when I gave myself the permission and made the time to do so. So here we are after all this time. We've got a few minutes left, and indeed that was the last drawing in mid-October, and now you can just see the view that we have been experiencing all this time. I just wanted to explain that, in fact, the reason the project ended its phase here was because there's a bit of a hint if I go back a couple of slides. It's the to let sign there, because it was at that point. And prior to that, actually, you may have noticed one of the drawings where we were painting the living room in preparation. It was in preparation for our departure. So I'm no longer staring out that window anymore. I've moved house, in part because of the COVID stamp duty holiday, so there is a COVID kind of link there. But it did mean that, in a way, I was also saying goodbye to this view, because I've moved on to different windows. And again, as I mentioned, I'm still now completing this work. I hope to publish it, but also to write a lot more about some of these reflections that I've just touched on this evening. So just to wrap up, I think that some of the key messages so far is that the quality of design, particularly windows, and the public and semi-public places that they overlook, are certainly important aspects for us as designers and of our experience of place. That in particular, having green space, whether it's semi-private or public, and also private, it can provide an important connection to nature, but particularly when it's shared space, it can alleviate social isolation and help to build community. That paying attention mindfully can bring multiple health benefits and new forms of understanding when we are paying attention to the external world. And that drawing as a process is one particular way of generating that mindful awareness, and itself can generate a rich source of qualitative information about place and our experience. So because I've spoken quite a bit about anxiety and about the impact that COVID's had, and as I've said, I think you may agree that some of those images are joyful, some of them less so. So if any of that resonates with you and you feel like you'd want to explore it more, there's certainly some extra resources here. So in this recording, you can always check out the links both to the Architects Mental Wellbeing Forum, really useful resource. We've got the ABS, who actually run a drawing event once a year in September, so I hope they'll be doing it again this year. Of course, the RIBA has been really active in putting out resources for us, and if you're interested specifically in mindfulness, I think the Oxford Mindfulness Centre is a good one to go to. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. As I said, it'll be lovely to actually see everybody that's here. And hello, Aisha, I can see you're here as well. Fantastic. And now that I'm back, I guess we can now open up to some questions. I'm looking at the time. We've got until 1:15. I understand if some people need to leave on the hour too, that's fine. But perhaps, Lucy, have there been any questions come up in the chat or any that you have spotted yet?
We haven't had any yet, but I don't know if anybody does have any that they'd like to sort of either put their hand up or ask in the chat now.
While we do, and I'll give people a moment, I just wanted to say as well, I presented these drawings recently to some students at the University of Nottingham, and it was one of my colleagues who kind of sat in stunned silence for a while and said, you know what, this was like, you know, when you go to a museum and you look at a historic event or whatever. He said, I feel like the pandemic is one of these events that they'll build museums about, and you've taken me on a visit already, and I wasn't quite ready to go there. I sort of went, oh, okay. So yeah, hence me perhaps noticing some of the isolation in the drawings more than I had at the time.
I've got a question, and I think it's something I mentioned because we've been really lucky to have this talk for the second time, so it's been a real treat for me kind of watching it again. And I think I mentioned this to you last time, Nicole, but I'd kind of question about the use of colour and kind of when, because sometimes there is colour, and I think and sometimes there isn't colour, and I just wondered if there was something specifically kind of around colour that you could talk about.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. It's the issue even more generally about the media or the medium and the choice of that. I could elaborate on, but at first I chose pen and ink deliberately because I didn't want to use sort of pencil where I could rub things out and make changes. It was almost accepting that I would do a drawing and it wouldn't be perfect. There may be inaccuracies, but I'd have to just persist with it. Oh, hello. We've got some other mics. It sounds very interesting. That sounds like there's a lot of fun going on there. Maybe not as relevant to this conversation, but that's okay. But onto colour. I started using colour actually as a response to the limitation of pen and ink. That there were just certain things that it wasn't going to work unless I either used colour pen or pencil, or indeed if I abandoned pen altogether and went to something more fluid. So again, yeah, that's where I got a bit more experimental, I suppose. So there wasn't a particular point where I rigidly said I'm going to have to stick to this the whole time. I was trying to be a bit more responsive to, in a way, to the opportunities that presented themselves and what seemed to be important. Similarly, the composition was like that too, whether I decided to look at the whole view within the frame or whether there was just one really small detail that I could zoom in on and draw at the exclusion of other things. Again, it was very much trying to not plan what I was going to draw at any time, but to be open to whatever was there and what I was noticing or what happened, what was going on out there that sort of almost demanded that I try to capture it and record it.
I think we have actually had a couple of questions. So Madeleine's asked whether you draw on separate pieces of paper or in a sketchbook.
Yeah, mostly a sketchbook, so several of them that I had to go through. There were again a couple of times where I felt that was restrictive and needed to go bigger, either because I was using sort of ink and wanted to paint and just needed a bit of extra space and more absorbent paper, so there were sort of technical choices. Indeed, there was one drawing where a couple that I did that were really big, and I found they actually took a little bit too much time. And also there's one that I did that was a panorama, which was because I wanted to show everything at once, but then I had to literally stand like at the window and look right down one side and get an outline and kind of draw the whole thing. So it wasn't, as you saw, the proportions of the window were vertical, not horizontal. So I feel like in some ways that drawing, I had to go big to capture everything, but I didn't really capture what it's like to be there.
Can you see? I don't know if you can see the chat. I'm happy to. There are a couple more. So there's.
Yeah, I can zoom down. It's just taking a bit of time. Oh, how long is there a published book? Do I think? Thanks, Mike. I have a proposal in with a publisher, so I am hopeful. These things take an age, and admittedly, at first I was thinking I'll have to do this quickly if anyone's going to be interested, because COVID will end and we will move on to other things. The more time stretches on, I'm starting to get a bit more patient and thinking, the more I keep talking about it, in fact, and getting responses from yourselves, it's making me think more about it and what I will write, and the extra work I want to do to link it to some of these other statistics and other research that's still being produced. So it is a work in progress in that sense, even though the drawings themselves are now done. That data set is complete. I do hope that I'll publish it, and if I do, I want to publish all the drawings, not just a selection, which might be tricky because publishers, it costs more to publish a book with lots of illustrations, but I kind of want it warts and all. I don't want to just pick out the so-called best drawings or the most typical ones, because I think part of the story here is that occasionally the drawings were rushed, or they were a bit repetitive, but that captures that day-by-day feeling of lockdown, for me at least. I think the sum is greater than the individual parts in that regard. Yeah. Thanks. Next, we had a question from Caroline, who said, how long did I spend on a drawing, and did I have a time limit and time of day? Yeah, really good sort of practical questions. I did not kind of set out with too many strict rules, apart from initially saying I won't use pencil. And I was being responsive again to what was going on outside the window, and also what was going on in my day-to-day routine. There were some times when I couldn't be at the window. I had to be in the other room working, or even at times when lockdown wasn't happening, but there was still a lot of restrictions on how we could interact and so on. But I was working back on campus, particularly in October, so I wasn't at home during the day to do it. I think sometimes there are some evening drawings that are really quite again capture evening and night views, but sometimes that was actually just because I got to the end of the day and hadn't done one yet. So and that was perhaps a bit more challenging at times. And then yeah, other drawings were long because I was really immersed in it and had the time. Others were short because I was limited with my time, or actually some of the drawings I'd look on and I really like didn't take very long, and I was just able to capture a moment and not overdo it and overwork it. I knew when the drawing was done. And other times I think perhaps I could have stopped drawing a bit sooner. I wish I hadn't spent quite as long, because then they get a bit overworked. Yeah. And when the question was it when something was happening? On more than one occasion, I did stop what I was doing to do a drawing, because I looked out the window, when the mowing guys were there, and it was literally, they're going to be here for a couple of minutes and then whoosh, and then they're gone. So when I heard the mowers, I took up my post. Other times it was quite the opposite. I was ready to do my drawing for the day. I sat by the window and I sat waiting for inspiration to come. And it wasn't always the case that I felt in the mood, or that I felt that something there said, yes, draw me. It was the same old tree, it was the same old street, in which case there was an element of either choosing a different medium or even just starting. What was really interesting for me anyway was that, and perhaps why I like that Ruskin quote so much, is that sometimes we can start a task feeling a bit uninspired, but once we get into it, once we get going, our mood and our approach and our energy can actually change. So it's one of the reasons I like sharing this experience, is because I think sometimes you've just got to kind of do something, and it itself generates the kind of positive impact, even if you're not that inclined to begin with. You just give it a go.
I think we've had another question. Can you see that one from Jessica?
Yeah. So thank you, Jessica, and thanks for the compliment. And have I considered doing this from my new home and the transition into a new normal? I have done. I've done a few drawings here in the new place, but not every day. And in fact, I'm tempted. I'm fortunate now that I'm not looking out over a semi-private space, but I'm a block away from the River Trent, which is a very public green space that I can look out this window here and just see glimpses of people along the embankment, and see glimpses of cyclists and dog walkers, and it's so busy and quite different. In some ways it's universal, it's similar to Clifton Street and Beeston, but in other ways it's very different. So I'm tempted to do my next series actually outside of the house and not do the window view, but just draw outdoor public space. But we'll see. I might not necessarily do it every day either. But having said that, again, it was part of this idea of mindful repetition, and also trying to always see the world afresh and be in the present. They call it beginner's mind in mindfulness often. That if by doing something, and I would also say that some of the students and people that have now done this exercise with me have said that at first they thought, there's going to be, there isn't much out my window. I'll draw it once and that'll be it. But coming back the next day, they started to sort of notice new things, and yeah, become more engrossed in it because it's a repetitive practice. So I'd be keen to continue exploring that, and again with other people, not just myself. Have I missed any questions up there so far?
I don't think so. I don't know. We've got a few minutes if anyone has got any sort of more questions for Nicole. I think it'd be fantastic to see your images in a book. From my point of view, I found this the last time as well. I find it really hypnotic, kind of watching, but then sometimes feel like I've missed something and want to go back and look at it again. So being able to actually kind of look at them I suppose in a more sort of studied way, be really lovely. But it's also I think it's a really lovely format, just having them kind of rolling in that way as well. Sort of works in a different way. I don't know. Last chance for questions if anyone's got any.
If not, I hope people are inspired to pick up a pen and paper.
Absolutely. I wanted to say thanks again, Nicole. It's been really great to have you back for Draw 2. Draw 1 was fantastic, and this has been great as well. And it's been lovely to have it as part of our International Women's Day programme this week. I think it's been a really nice way to kind of round off the programme actually. And I think you referencing, we had Dr. Frances Hollis speaking on Monday, and I think there were some things that kind of were resonating for me, and kind of then looking at your presentation today. I love that Hockney quote, stress is worrying about something in the future and art is now. I don't think there's a better argument for picking up a pen than that actually. So I think that really for me kind of encapsulates a lot of what you've been talking about. But yeah, no, it's been brilliant, and thanks again, and thanks to everyone for coming tonight, albeit virtually. Oh, we've got somebody typing, so I'll finish what I'm going to say, and then if someone else wants to chip in, that's fine. I'd also just like to thank again our sponsor Zipstock Brick, who sponsored all of the events in our International Women's Day programme this week. And yeah, Caroline is typing, so I don't know whether it's a question or a kind of thank you as well. So we'll just wait and see.
Okay. So in fact, I should have also said, I think, thanks a lot. I was going to say, because this was a bit, in some ways it's not rushed, but yes, that format of sweeping through is a bit experimental. I feel like there's so much I could say about individual moments and elaborate on them, but at the same time I wanted to try to show them all within the time that we have. If anyone did have any queries, or if you're interested in the process or future opportunities to run this kind of work again, I'm waiting for a research grant outcome. So I'm hoping that I can do this on a wider scale. I'm also hoping lockdown ends though. So it's if the priority would be lockdown ending first, but as long as it's continuing, I'd like to also be able to share this with other people doing their drawings to see what they see and what they experience. But if anyone has got any queries about that, please feel free to contact me. I haven't put my email on this, I realise, but
or I can pop. I mean, depending on how you want to do it. I'm happy to put mine in, or you can put yours in now if you want to. Nicole,
I'll just put it in
great.
The shop. Yeah.
Brilliant.
And thanks, Aisha. so is yours. And so I've just put in my email.
Great.
Yeah, great. And thanks, Lucy.
Fantastic. No, not at all. It's been brilliant. It has been a really lovely way, I think, to kind of round up the week, and lots of different events, but all kind of some sort of common strands, I think, as well. So thank you. Okay, thanks everyone.
Yeah, thanks all.